Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Stephen Bowman, who is the Professor Emeritus in the Judaic Studies Department at the University of Cincinnati, and who just published a complete English translation of Sefer Yosippon or Yosippon, which is the book is titled Sefer Yosippon, a 10th century history of ancient Israel, and is published by Wayne State University Press. So thank you, Professor Bowman, for joining me.
Delighted to be here.
So let's sort of tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I first discovered Yosippon, which is the Greek ending, which helped us to understand where he came from. In any event, when I was doing my dissertation work, starting at the Hebrew University in the mid-'60s, and then later at Ohio State University, where I finished my PhD in late Byzantine history. And then subsequently, I've been publishing on the Greek Jews during the Holocaust and World War II. And recently, I published another book, which is a novel, semi-autographical novel by Nathan Mayer on his career in the Union Army during the Civil War. Fascinating book called Differences by Nathan Mayer. And so Yosippon, in effect, is a very interesting story, at least how I got to it. During the late Byzantine period, in fact, it was written during the Byzantine period, probably sometime in the early 10th century or mid-10th century, which is the first dated reference we have to it. And then it was rewritten in southern Italy in the end of the 11th, early 12th century, and then continued to be re-edited by scholars up until the 20th century. In the 20th century, David Flusser finally spent his life's work in two areas. One was the study of Yosippon from the manuscripts. He was the first one to study the manuscripts. And secondly, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which which were discovered about the same time that he was doing his editing process on the Yosippon. So when I got to Jerusalem in 1978, I called up Professor Flusser and congratulated him on his publication, which came out in 1978. And told him I was interested in Yehuda ibn Mosconi, who was the 14th century editor of Yosippon. So being Flusser, he said, come over and bring your dissertation. So that led to a generation-long friendship in my work on Yosippon. I visited him every time I went to Jerusalem. In any event, I decided to translate Yosippon about that time, and it already started before I went to Jerusalem. And then I spent off and on the past 45 years, almost, translating it.
So your decision to translate it was just you're interested in it. You wanted to make it available to English speakers. It was something you were interested in doing.
Absolutely. It's a major scholarly piece. In fact, Flusser claims that he was really the only historian in our 20th century definition in the Middle Ages. He went to the sources. He translated manuscripts, Latin manuscripts. He didn't know Greek. He knew all the Hebrew midrashim of southern Italy in the 9th and 10th centuries, the great Hebrew Renaissance that took place in the heel of Italy. And he produced this absolutely magnificent book, which is the first Hebrew history of ancient Israel, following Josephus's Greek rendition of Jewish history.
Okay, so I want to discuss that, Sefer Yosippon and Josephus. But before that, just one final thing. It's been translated into many languages, and we can talk about that later. It's the history of the book. But is this your English translation? Is this the first full English translation of it?
It's the first full English translation. What I did translate was David Flusser's Volume 1, of his two-volume Yosippon, and that included not only the text of Yosippon that he published, but also the Alexander cycle that was later included as part of Yosippon to expand the chapter on Alexander. And he added all the interpolations that took place from the 11th to the 15th century. So all of that material was included in this translation.
Okay, and we can talk more about that because there are many editions, as you mentioned, Flussers, there was Hamanner's semi, critical, whatever you want to call it. You can talk about that. And then there's the standard one. Many people are familiar now in the Sfarim store. There's this 2-volume with Nekudas, but that's not any sort of critical edition. But we can talk about what you used here and what it is. Okay, let's talk about the Sefer Yosippon as a whole, its biography, so to speak. As you mentioned, and as listeners are familiar or not, it's not Josephus. So what is it? Who wrote it? When was it written? Kind of talk about we can break all those questions up, but let's talk generally about the book.
Well, there's a small manuscript tradition that begins with the Cairo Geniza fragments that are now being edited and studied. Plus, I looked at some of them that were in Cambridge and elsewhere, but we now have more that are being discovered. And then in the 10th century, in the year 935, someone copied the book. Some people think that it was written in 935, but it's more likely that it was edited in 935. And this was the basis of the text that Rabbi Meir HaGolah copied, and that shows up in the 15th century manuscript, that particular colophon. And that's the only date that we have with it, other than any internal date that one can surmise. So 935 then is the beginning of our dating tradition, but the text itself is probably somewhat older.
Okay, first of all, you mentioned the colophon, so for those that aren't familiar, it's at the end of the book, at the end of a book.
It's in the middle of the book, which is very interesting.
Okay, usually colophon's at the end, so this one is in the middle of the book.
Absolutely, and that's the fantastic part about it, which in fact identifies it. And he says basically he defines his historiography or his scholarship mostly on Josephus's reputation as an historian. He himself read it. He was quite learned, the synonymous author. And he says, I copied and I collected. I collected the material, ve'hetakti, this material. And the question is, how do we translate the word he'takti, which has a number of different meanings? And some people think it means I wrote. Some people mean it says I copied. Some people means I edited. So in effect, this is where the real question is, and that's why we don't know exactly when we can date the beginning of it. But it comes as the high point of the Hebrew Renaissance in southern Italy in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries.
Okay, now this work was not written by Josephus, Flavius Josephus, which I've done a number of other episodes in the podcast people can go listen to. That is not what this is. This is a different version. To be clear, there are some that think this is the original or the Hebrew version of Josephus. It is not what this is. Correct?
It was recognized as the original Josephus by the classical scholars of the 16th and 17th centuries. And many of the Hasidim still consider it to be written by Josephus. But it was not written by Josephus. Josephus wrote in Greek. He claims to have written the story of the Jewish rebellion in his people's own language. We don't know if that was Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever the case may be, but we have nothing. But it was because of that statement that he made that some people think that Yosippon, and did through much of the Middle Ages, think that he in fact had written that.
Now, just to further clarify for listeners, so how do we know that this book Yosippon is not the original Josephus? That we know that this is not Josephus?
Because all of the editing through the 5 centuries of its editing, the scribes deleted the author's name. And we only have the author's references in a manuscript attributed to Yerachmiel, who was a late 11th century, early 12th century author in southern Italy. And he tells us in the manuscript that sometimes the author says, and this is what Joseph Ben-Gurion said, Josephus Ben-Gurion said, and this is what I say. So it's clear that if you study the manuscripts, we know that Josephus was not the author of Yosippon. He was the source of much of Yosippon, but not the author. So now that we've straightened that out, and it's interesting that Flusser published his first article, the author of Yosippon, in Sion in 1953, which was exactly 1,000 years after the date of 953 in the manuscript.
Right. Yeah, I think earlier you said 935. Right. It should be 953.
No, 953.
Right. 953. Got it. Okay, perfect. So another thing interesting, you mentioned Yosef Ben-Gurion. So Josephus' name was Yosef Ben Matisyahu, not Yosef Ben-Gurion, but Yosippon, it kind of claims it's Yosef Ben-Gurion, right? Do we know where that comes from?
Yeah, he screwed up. It's as simple as that. There were two Josephuses, Yosef Ben Matisyahu, which is Josephus, and Yosef Ben-Gurion, who was one of the generals. And so they figured if it was Josephus, he must have been Yosef Ben-Gurion. And that, in effect, by doing that, should have been a clue to scholars that this is not the Josephus ben Matisyahu that is traditionally identified as Josephus.
Okay. Now, as you said, the main source of the book is Josephus. So we'll get to some other sources, but the Book of Maccabees, 1, 2. But this Sefer Yosippon, if you just give an overview, so what is included? It kind of follows the structure of Josephus.
Well, he starts off with the biblical text. He starts off with the biblical text and continues through the biblical. He skips quickly through the biblical text because his first instance is to follow Josephus in talking about the Romans and the relationship to the Jews. And he wants to show that the Romans are actually bastard children of the Jews. So he starts off in the very first chapter, first with the biblical genealogy from Noah onward in Genesis 10, and then he tells the story of the girls who were captured by the tribe of Benjamin, which the author was very happy to include because he knew well the story of the rape of the Sabine women, which was written roughly about the same time as the story in the Book of Judges, namely 753, I think, was the founding of Rome, and so that was probably just before it. So this area, which was edited in the Book of Judges sometime towards the end of the 8th century, was fine for him to link these two together.
Yep.
Then he continues on through the beginning with the rise of the Persian Empire, the conquests of Cyrus and Darius of Nebuchadnezzar's empire, and then continues through the Book of Daniel, etc., until he comes to the Maccabean period.
Right, and then he'll continue.
So he starts with the biblical material, and then once he gets to the Maccabean period, he has two sources to rely on. One is the Book of Maccabees 1, basically, which is pure history, well written source material, and occasionally some of the material from Maccabees 2. And then he switches to all of this is through Maccabees that he had available and through Josephus. And Josephus, when he writes about the Maccabees, didn't know the Maccabees firsthand. I mean, probably knew the books of Maccabees, but he also had the material of Nicholas of Damascus, who was the secretary of Herod, who wrote a 144-book survey of Jewish history. And that's where his material on Herod comes from, as written, as copied, as rewritten by Josephus. And then all of this material he puts into his inimitably biblical style, which is a midrashic style. And then he continues on to the war with Rome, which is basically not from Josephus per se, because he only had 16 books of Josephus's. I see he had Josephus's Jewish War and Josephus's Jewish War, but only 16 books of it. So the first part of it is from Josephus. Josephus's Bellum. And the second part is from Pseudo-Hegesippus, who is another anonymous scholar. He was possibly a Jew who converted to Christianity somewhere in the second half of the 4th century. And the dates for Pseudo-Hegesippus are usually in the 360s. And he wrote a diatribe against Israel, showing that they deserved the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple because of their murder of Jesus, which was a trope in Christianity already since the 1st century. So Pseudo-Hegesippus then is the main text that he is rendering into Hebrew. Now, Pseudo-Hegesippus wrote in a highly stylized and obtuse Latin of the 4th century, much different than the Latin of Jerome, which is very clear. And in fact, Yosippon knew or did made quite use of Jeremiah of Jerome in his rewriting of this material on Josephus and Philo and some of the material as well in it, in addition to other Latin sources that he used.
Okay, so Jerome was one of the church figures, for those that don't know. And also you mentioned the story of the Sabine women. That's an early part of Rome's history, mythology. So for those
that he got from Livy, his history of ancient Rome.
Right, Livy, the Roman historian. Okay.
Right.
So there's a couple of things to get into. But let's work through the work. So as you mentioned, who the author was. Now, but once it kind of, I guess, gets popular, appears, as you mentioned, 953, it really takes off, right? It's really super popular throughout the ages. I'll just mention a couple, and you can talk more about this. But I mean, it's quoted. Listeners, I'm sure, are familiar. Rashi quotes it, Ibn Ezra, Ramban, many other Rishonim. It's quoted later on by the Maral, I think, in Baragoyla, David Gans, and Tzemach David. Later on, it's quoted by many. It's used by many.
Everybody quotes it. Everybody. Why did they quote it? Well, Rashi made a hand copy from the manuscript of the Rosh HaGolah that was used in the Ashkenazi yeshivot. So he made his own copy, as well as he copied many of the Byzantine midrashim that were available to him there. So Rashi said the reason that he studies Yosippon is because it gives him the history of basically the history of the Second Temple, which we didn't have in Hebrew, and most of it didn't read Latin or Greek. Most of the Hebrew scholars, not too much later, to the Renaissance, really. Yehuda ben Mosconi in the 14th century was kind of a really bright guy. He wrote, actually, he studied with a major Byzantine scholar, a philosopher, and he fell in love with Ibn Ezra, and he ran all over the Mediterranean, the East Mediterranean, the Byzantine Mediterranean, collecting manuscripts of Ibn Ezra, kind of a postgraduate research project. And along the way, he found Yosippon. He found 7 different copies of it on different islands, different places. And he says, not only does it give the history of the Second Temple by an eyewitness, because he considered Josephus to be the author of it, but because it taught Jews the sins of their errors, the infighting that led to the destruction of the temple, and it also taught Jews how to live their lives in preparation for the ultimate redemption. So Yehuda ibn Mosconi's manuscript, which is dated somewhere to the late 1350s, was then re-edited and published in Constantinople in beginning of the 16th century. And that's the basic text that Homener edited and added some rabbinic sources to it in the mid 20th century. So the rivalry was that Homener's text came out, and that became the official text of the religious community. And then Flusser's text came out, which was a scholarly treatment of the manuscripts, which he was able to claim was close to the original text.
Right.
That he called a secular text.
So it's kind of the two competing, so to speak, we'll just call them critical editions. There's two kind of, one, like I said, based on manuscript.
One was a rabbinic critical edition, and the other was a scholarly, modern scholarly critical tradition.
Right, and just I'll mention it here already. Flusser's is definitely available from Mosad Bialik. I think Homener's is still available. It's funny because in most people that buy Hebrew one, I know for me, if you go into farm stores in America, they have this 2-volume, with Nekuda's translation. That's not translation in Hebrew. There's standard edition.
Well, that's
not anything.
It's a kid's volume.
But no, they have it as 2 volumes with Nekuda's. It's regular. It's like a regular Sefer, but it's not Homener's. It's not anything. That's just
It's just a text. I didn't check the actual text that they used for it, but it was a charming book. I don't know if I bought it or not, but I saw it in Jerusalem.
It's I just want to mention. So for those that are interested in the standard, like you say, rabbinic one, the standard, Hebrew critical, they really should get Homener's. But I think it's still around. I think it's accessible for those that are interested. But anyways, leaving that aside, I just want to mention something else. You mentioned Mosconi. Interestingly, was published through Mosad Bialik a year or 2 or 3 ago, a 3-volume edition of his commentary Ibn Ezra and Ibn Ezra. Just mentioning it for those that didn't see. Mm-hmm. So that was published 3 large volumes. You mentioned his name. Okay, so and then there were like I mentioned, the Morale quotes him and discusses Yosippon. I mean, there are a lot. Like you said, everybody, the Rishonim will use him. Everyone really uses him and engages with it. Now, but to clarify, the Rishonim, like you mentioned, Rashi and others, they think that this is Josephus, right?
Absolutely. They didn't know any different because they didn't read the manuscripts.
Right.
Or at least we each one of the manuscripts that we have, it's clear as Flusser established that the scribes just removed the author's name wherever it might have appeared, since they considered it to be Josephus. It's interesting that you talk about that. There was a Spanish translation at the end of the 15th century that turns out to be connected with the 1492 exile of the Jews from Spain. And it became very, very important, at least in terms of establishing part of the identity of Madrid as the new Rome and moving it into that ancient tradition. that Spain was now going to be the new Rome with its empire and etc.
So that's something else I want to pick up on. You mentioned everyone used to use it. I mean, can you talk a little bit to the popularity? I don't know if you have the numbers of how many manuscripts are floating around or how many printed editions. You just mentioned a Spanish translation. I mean, just give the listeners a sense of how wildly popular this work was throughout the centuries.
All right, the Spanish tradition. There's a Catalan translation of Yosippon in the 15th century. In the early 18th century, there was a Ladino translation. In the 17th century, there were 2 Yiddish translations, and then multiple chapbooks that were available. In fact, I've known of a wonderful book, Derech Rechoka, which I translated some years ago, which was part of the late 19th century fascination with Yosippon. And there are Polish translations and Russian translations. The Russian translation was already available in the 11th century. Arabic translations from the 11th century and later. Supposedly a Yemenite translation of it in the 10th or 11th century that was known in Spain to Shmuel HaNagid. There's a Japanese translation of Josephus, but not of Yosippon. They might be now that I translated into English. Polish translation, as I said, I found a Dutch translation. It's major translations of it. The first English translation actually is not of Yosippon, but is taken from the Sefer HaKabbalah of Ibn Dawood, Abraham Ibn Dawood, a small section of it, and that has recently been translated and studied and etc. But that was by Peter Morvin in the middle of the 16th century, which has an interesting American tradition. It was the first book printed in America in the 18th century and continued to be published into the early 19th century in Massachusetts and in Vermont, interestingly enough. But that's also a anti-Jewish book. But that's part of the proof, if you will. The Jews deserve what they got, and they'll never have a kingdom again, etc. In England, in the 16th century and 17th centuries, Josephus was extremely popular, and Yosippon being considered part of Josephus, it too was then studied in order to find out the sources, if you will, for the Maccabean period. There's a whole interesting history of scholarship that's connected with the text, both in Hebrew and in its various translations.
Now, how about, I don't know if you mentioned the printed editions, when it was the first printed edition of Yosippon was, and
the first printed edition was actually in English, the English of Peter Morvin. I guess Mosconi's was actually that was printed in the beginning of the 16th century by Ibn Yachin in Constantinople. The first one was in the late 15th century. Was in the late 15th century, 1476, I believe, in Mantua. And subsequent traditions, though, were based upon Ibn Yahya's 1506 or 1508 edition. And then it just kept on being reprinted in Hebrew and Yiddish. But I haven't found, and Morvin was continually reprinted into the 19th century from the 16th. So at least in certain areas, it was in continuous print. But nobody looked at the manuscripts. And and that's what that made Fluss's reputation, if you will, just before he moved and mastered the Dead Sea Scrolls, which then became his second great project.
So now we'll talk more about the difference between Josephus and Yosippon, but let's first talk about Chanukah. It's coming now to Chanukah, and this is something that really, besides for the Gemara, which talks about Chanukah, but a lot of the history and the stories of Chanukah really were known throughout the centuries from Sefer Yosippon. This is where Jews only read Hebrew,
only from the 10th century on.
Right, only from the 10th century on. Exactly. I mean, from those centuries on. I should clarify that. Exactly.
I will give you one short paragraph, which is all he has to say about the about that. This is after the defeat of Antiochus. He says that Judah, the son of Matityahu, and the congregation of the Hasidim, and this is very important because the Hasidim were the backbone of Yehuda's army. The backbone of Yehuda's army, which he pushes all the way back. Yosippon pushes all the way back. He mentions them first in the time of Alexander as a military group, and they continue until the end of the Churban and Masada, the Hasidim as a militant group, which we should keep in mind compared to today's Hasidim. In any event, the congregation of the Hasidim came to Jerusalem and destroyed the altars that the uncircumcised had built, and they purified the house of the Gentiles' idols. They built a new altar, gave meat for the sacrifice, and arranged wood, but they did not find the holy fire. They called unto God, and fire came forth from the stone upon the altar, and they put wood upon it. This fire lasted until the third exile. They dedicated the altar on the 25th of Kislev and set forth the showbread and lit the candles and praised God by reading the Hallel for 8 days. Absolutely no mention of the Chanukah story, because he had early touched on the sacred fire much earlier in the times of Cyrus, of Koresh. And there, the elders who came with their 44,000 back to Jerusalem, let's see. For we do have we built the we have slaughtered this. We built the come to the place, prepared your altar, and according to its measure, and we have slaughtered a sacrifice and have arranged logs upon the altar, and sacred meat we have given according to custom, but we do not have authority to sacrifice before you a strange fire. For the sacred fire is not among us, because Jeremiah, your servant, and the chiefs of your priests, who went into exile in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, hid it. Now what should we do, Lord? The heavens give us advice and assistance, for the authority is in your hands to aid and strengthen your servants. And then he has a short paragraph in which he discovers, in which he tells how the sacred fire was rediscovered. So can I read that one? And then very quickly.
Go ahead.
And while they were praying like this, it happened that there was an old man, one of the priests, and he remembered the place where Jeremiah had hidden the sacred fire. The old man went outside the camp, and all the old men ran after him. And behold, under the section of the wall was a cistern with a great stone over it, and it was plastered over with whitewash. They broke the plaster and rolled the stone from atop the cistern and found at the bottom of the cistern water, oily and thick and dense as honey. They returned and told Ezra. Ezra came to the cistern and said to the priests, "Go down and bring the water in your hands." They didn't know the word for oil at that time. "The water in your hands, but let not a stranger touch it, only for priests of the seed of Aaron the priest, for that is the sacred fire." So the priests descended and brought the water with their own hands, And they went to the temple and poured the water upon the altar over the sacrifice and logs. And when they had done this, suddenly a most terrible fire burst out and kindled the flame. And the fire consumed and increased and was greatly strengthened, so that the priests fled from the house, unable to withstand the fire. The fire increased and devoured the offering and the logs and encircled the whole house, purifying the vessels and the temple. The fire in the house subsided, remaining only on the altar, where it belonged. From that day on. They put logs on it, and the fire continued until the second exile. This is why he didn't have to put in the story under Yehuda Maccabee, because he'd already given this wonderful chapter on the finding of the sacred fire, which continued to burn until the end of the second temple.
Right, and this is again, this is the fire on the mizbeach, and like you're saying, you say there's no story of Chanukah. I mean, we can talk more about it. There's an extensive story of Chanukah, but you mean the pach shemen, the oil that they're finding, the oil, that's not in here. He's saying that there's a different miracle, different nature of the fire. That's the fire they davened, and the fire came out on the mizbeach. This fire that lasted until the korban. That's what he says. So there's a different kind of thing in here. He talks about Halal 8 days. He talks about Yehuda Maccabee, Matisyo. I don't know what else you want. We can talk more about how he really, again, this is really, he talks about that, the decrees that he goes through really. Another thing perhaps to mention here that he's famous, I guess, is chapter 15, as you titled The Death of the Mother and Her 7 Sons. So she's kind of unnamed, but there are some versions of Yosippon that have her as Chana, correct? That's Absolutely. Where the name originates. Yeah. So that name kind of originates.
There are other names for her also, not only in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in Syriac.
But this name of Chana
the reason they called her Chana is from chapter 2 of Samuel, the mother of the who will give birth to 7 sons. And then they linked them together. I mean, this is the rabbinic mind. It's perfectly the same as the ancient mind. They link together similar subjects.
Right. So that's this. So, but not all of the versions of Yosippon have it as Chana, right?
No, of course not. In the printed versions, they corrected it, or felt they corrected it. Why not? I mean, it doesn't hurt anybody.
Right. Something else interesting from him about Chanukah, we talk more about Chanukah, is that I think he has by Matisyo and by Yehuda, he sent him out saying, Mil Hashem Elai. He says, whoever among you is with me, whoever is for God, for the Lord my God to me. I'm reading your translation. Right. I think does this come from him? Is this from Yosippon?
Yeah. In fact, Yosippon adds many of these wonderful statements. Perhaps the most important statement, at least for 20th century Star Trekkers, is the one that he does in chapter, I think it's 44, where he reads or he copies the letter from Antony to the ambassadors, to the Jewish ambassadors. And at the end of the letter, he says to them, "Techiev v'tatzliach, atem v'kol anshe shlomenu." And that flabbergasted me, because how does that translate? Live, parentheses long, and prosper. And I said, where did I hear that before? Aha, we have a Jewish spaceman from the island of from the planet Vulcan, who introduces this wonderful quip, not from Yosippon, because Leonard Nimoy probably never read Yosippon. He knew Yiddish, so he would know the phrase "Anshe Shlomenu," which was picked up by Yiddish writers and used from the 18th century on, Hasidic writers and Yiddish writers. But "live long and prosper" was his own, which I went around Jerusalem asking people if they knew the phrase "Tichyev v'tatzliach," and they said, "Yeah, we hear it in the street." And Flusser never mentioned it.
Interesting. So for those that are wondering, just to make sure this doesn't go over their heads, you're referring to Spock, the USS Enterprise. So I just to make sure this doesn't go over every listener's head. Okay, because I don't know how many people are familiar with that. Okay. So you mentioned, so again, there's more about Chanukah. Obviously, again, this is where, besides for the Gemara, understand, really, this is where a lot of the stories of Chanukah, I guess, were known, as you mentioned, as we said. So there's, a couple of chapters in here on that. And then he obviously goes through the Churban. Obviously, a lot of how the Churban was known, and the war with the Romans and the whole Churban Abayis is known from Yosippon as well, because he talks about that extensively. Now, how does he differ from Josephus, whether it's Chanukah or there? I mean, I know you mentioned before that he has many other sources, but are there specific areas that we can see, okay, he's very different from our, version of Josephus that we have?
Yeah, because the version we have is many Greek versions, many Latin versions that are translations of Josephus, many adjustments by scholars. In fact, the story of the woman who ate her son, which was used by the Christians in 6 major translations, all pointing to the evil of the Jews, and probably is one of the major contributors to the blood libel of the Middle Ages, since they all read it. But it was all written by the Christians in a very hostile manner. Yosippon turns around and quoting Dvarim and other sources, really shows the pathos of this poor woman, and literally the sacrifice that she's making to save him from a worse death, namely starvation, since no one was expected to survive the peace. And what Yosippon does consistently is he takes these passages that the Christians have twisted into a curse on the Jews, as he turns around and translates them in a positive manner, at least historically in a positive manner, for his Jewish readers. So they're reading 2 different books. One book is anti-Jewish, and the other book is a pro-nationalist, secular treatment of a great tragedy in Jewish history that, in fact, as Josephus tells us, was caused by the Jews themselves. Sad commentary on what might be going on today in Jerusalem. But in any event, Josephus, not Josephus, Yosippon was an extremely well-educated, well-read scholar who traveled much through his Byzantine environment, at least the Italian Byzantine environment, and probably even in the Croatian area, which was full of merchants from all over, as well as southern Italy itself, and the Arab environment that they suffered from in the attacks from Sicily and later the Normans. But that was after Yosippon, when the Normans came in. But many of the manuscripts that existed in the great yeshivas that were in Apulia were looted, burned, and whatever survived, fragments of it, are now being found in the book covers of Renaissance books. Why not? I mean, the Nazis would use Torah scrolls to make inner soles for shoes. So the recycling of the Jews is another tragic part of history. But in any event, so the more these books or these books are carefully taken apart, the more manuscript fragments we have to illuminate the tradition.
Yeah, that's kind of the so-called European Geniza. And Simcha Emanuel published 2 volumes on it, and he's working on it.
Right.
Yeah. Now, something else to discuss. You kind of mentioned this earlier. I just want to just to emphasize this is that the edition that you used in translating, and this works. Your translated edition is you use Flusser. I mean, did you use Haminer? Did you use other editions of text? Did you add other things?
Occasionally, I checked Haminer, but Haminer wasn't working from the manuscripts. He was working basically with this early 16th century text. What he did is he added his scholarly editions, and when I was studying, I was doing work at Yad Vashem, and I went across the street, the Shteirot, to talk to Rabbi Wertheimer, who wrote the introduction to Hamanus. And I said to him, "What do you think of Flusser's book?" And he says, "Well, Josephus wrote it." That was his answer, and we didn't get much further than that. I mean, I was shell shocked, basically. But in any event, we had a very nice meeting. But he was absolutely convinced, and if you read his introduction, you'll see that he stresses it immensely, that this is the official religious tradition, since it came from this major Talmudic scholar.
So, but you did. So, as you're saying, you used the Haminer a little bit. Did you use any other editions that's kind of standard one, or no? You kind of mainly this is a translation kind of
this
Flusser.
Is a translation of Flusser's work, right? Because this was the only modern scholarly edition, and it deserves to be put into the hands of not only general readers who can read anything else that they want. For example, they could read part of Yerachmiel's Chronicles, which were published by which were published at the end of the 19th century in Oxford. But in any event, and scholars would be using this. I've gotten inquiries from a number of scholars and students to introduce them to this text. Then, if they want, there's absolutely no reason why they can't go through the rest of the scholarly tradition, whether rabbinic scholarly or Talmudic scholarly traditions, or modern religious traditions. I mean, it's all right, but they can read whatever they want. But the point is that we now have something that's based on an attempted reconstruction of an original text from the surviving manuscripts. So that's the justification for Flusser's translation, and also his commentary and notes. And what's important is that Flusser showed to what extent Hegesippus or pseudo-Hegesippus was the major source that he was working through as he translated. And he only periodically went to Josephus, the Latin Josephus that he had available to him.
Now, that's another thing I wanted to, you mentioned the notes there of Flusser. So you have a small introduction here to this, in here, and then you have, there's notes. They're not, over the top, but there's a fair amount of notes. Those notes are your own notes. Those are some of Flusser's notes. What are those notes?
Well, I've translated Flusser's notes as well, because this is his edition is what I'm doing, and then I just added with my initials some supplementary notes and comments. But mainly this is his work. There are now two major projects on the Yosippon that scholars should be aware of. One is in Bern, Switzerland, published by the supported by the government and Amsterdam. So Bern and Amsterdam. And they are publishing a number of texts now studying the manuscript tradition itself, how the manuscript tradition was used, much in a way that the Josephus manuscript tradition is being studied by a number of scholars. And in Beersheba, there was another major project going on, which is to create a kind of dictionary of Yosippon, much like the dictionary that you may have had somebody talk about before earlier. The tradition, the dictionary of Achimat ben Paltiel, in his famous Sefer Yosippon. So they made a dictionary of it, an historical dictionary. So they're doing the same thing now for the Yosippon. So we should learn more about these elements. And what's important is that given that Yosippon was really creative as well as a historian of manuscripts and a copyist to some extent of manuscripts and a translator of manuscripts, he also put in his own wisdom and his own special additions to it, especially the way that he reinterpreted the historical material, which Flusser shows by his mastery of later scholarship, that he came to the same conclusions that 19th century scholars of the Second Temple came to in their study of the same sources. So in effect, that's why this tradition is basically the much needed translation of his original, and it also has the interpolations that came in subsequent copies, because Yosippon itself was an open text. So any copyist who found something of interest could add them. There's nothing against it. So he did. So the interpolations that came in were in the mostly the 11th and 12th century. And these, some of them were polemical against the Christians, because the Christians were writing polemical stuff against the Jews for the previous 1,000 years, and still are. So they wrote some of course they were doing this for their own Jewish readers, who were the only ones who were reading Hebrew at the time. So in effect, what we have then is a piece of medieval scholarship in its own words for the general public.
Okay, so first of all, Achimat I didn't do. I think Robert Bonfil, right, did the English edition of that.
Yeah, he did the text, but there was earlier there had been this major dictionary, a computerized study of all the words in Achimat. Since we still haven't figured out that text either.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, in the back of here, I just want to mention what is in the back. Do you have an appendix about Titus in one of the manuscripts? Is this all from Flusser? There's additions to.
So there's all this back material is from Flusser. He has it separated, so I translate it separately. Previous to that is the Alexander cycle, and that was Flusser's dissertation at the end of the 1940s. Which he published at the Hebrew University, and had published it in several places. And this is important because this is based on a 10th century Greek text that was translated into Hebrew.
Do you want to mention for the listeners what this is?
Well, Alexander was the hero of the ancient world and of the medieval world. And everybody was writing stories about all the ethnic languages where had cycles of Alexander stories in them. So this is one of the earliest, this 10th century one, and since it was translated into Hebrew, as opposed to the translations of the Arabic cycle into Hebrew that was done in France. In the 12th century and others. But this was extremely interesting because it was translated directly from the Greek, literally verbatim, almost word for word. which helps to the reestablishment of the original 4th century story of Callinicus, who published the first novel of Alexander. And that became the basis of many of the Alexander cycles. I think there's now a 400 or 500 page book published by Cambridge University Press on Alexander through the literature of Alexander through the millennia. But Alexander's still the basic hero. It extended all the way to Tibet, his story, and art based on his story.
So this is included in the back. It's about, say how many chapters this is. It's 14 chapters, so it's small. Also, I want to mention that you have also a index, a source index, a general index. So there's kind of indexes here in the book. Just a couple questions on the translation, how you translate. As you mentioned, you worked on this for some 45 years, so it's a while. I mean, how did you go about translating it? Your method of translating style. How did you go about that?
Well, yeah, what I first recognized was when I started reading it. It read like the Book of Kings, and later Midrashic literature, which is based on that, and then the later Hasidic stories, which continue this and are the basis of the modern Hebrew material. So I took my Ulpan Hebrew and started translating, and as my Hebrew increased, I gave sections of it to people, and we worked on it. But basically, it was a slow process. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but I was sidetracked into studying and writing about the Holocaust of Greek Jewry during World War II, and some other projects. So, in effect, this is I did not move beyond his style, which is simple. He uses real words occasionally. He himself had to translate this obtuse Latin of the 4th century into something that people could read. He did not use any of the Talmudic material that he did not know. Probably he doesn't mention any of it, or he doesn't use any of it except what he might have heard in the synagogue or from other people. But he himself was mainly a Latin scholar, as well as a master Hebrew scholar. So with the limited Hebrew that he had, 40,000 words, I think, in Hebrew is the rough estimate that we have, he was able to create an eminently readable and exciting book. And what is interesting is Saul Lieberman, who was the great Talmudic scholar at ATS, said it was a children's book and dismissed it because it didn't have any Talmud in it. Ben Zion Wacholder, who is a major Talmudic scholar, ultimately at Hebrew Union College, told me that he started reading Yosippon at age 5. And this was not only his master of Jewish history, but also introduced him to the problem of Breshit and history, because everything after the Beit is history. So he spent his life trying to understand Breshit, as opposed to the Kabbalists who try and understand everything before Breshit, which is another story. But in any event, yeah.
Yeah, just another question about the general translation here. So, especially with names, like what you chose stylistically. Like you mentioned Judah, and then you write Yehuda, Judah. Sometimes you say shemen, but then sometimes, like I'm trying to the words. Sometimes you kind of use like the Hebrew spelling, so to speak, and sometimes you went like, for example, you wrote like the holiday of Sukkot, and then on the bottom you mentioned the Korban Sukkot. Like I'm trying to figure out like stylistically either how you chose one over the other, and sometimes why it's like two ways, even on the same page.
Yeah, well, that's what should we say? It's called the problem of rereading the book so many times that you skip over what you should be fixing. I spent weeks putting in diacritical marks, so I might have missed some of those as well. So the point is that I tried to keep the transliterations of the Greek and Latin names as he pronounced them, or as he tried, in other words, as they were pronounced for him, rather than correcting him as modern scholars would have done. But that sort of loses the flavor of what the Hebrew reader at that time would have been reading. And I try to do that. If I failed in certain spots, my apologies to the reader, but let him know that there was a good attempt to do so. But in any event, I read certain passages to friends and colleagues over the years. Comments were accepted, and this is how translations are usually done. And if there is a failure to it, I'm sure the critics will find all of them.
As always, so ches also is the H with the dot on the bottom, the kind of that way of doing it. That's the way you did it, right? So that is you can see that, and that's a ches. Okay, so basically as we wrap up, I mean, who in general, I guess, is a question about Yosippon in general and kind of your translation. Who is kind of geared towards, would you say, the work?
I said scholars. I mean, scholars were absolutely fascinated by Yosippon, especially his first chapter, which is a mid-10th century geography, or 10th century geography, or late 9th, 10th century geography of Eastern Europe. Some Polish tribes are mentioned for the first time, and various pieces of history that came to him. So I suspect that in his travels, he met diplomats, he met other scholars. The merchants, the Radhaniya merchants, who were the international merchants that started in France and went to China, that we hear about, continued. They passed through southern Italy. They passed through Byzantium. They passed through North Africa. So we're talking about a medieval world that was extremely rich in sources, oral sources, and he heard them. And included them where he could, when he could, and how he could for his story. And his story of attempting to prove that the Romans, who were the bastard sons of Jacob, through Esau, and his fantastic story of Zehu, Ben Eliphaz, is absolutely fantastic. It took me a while to figure out that this was Hercules in Hebrew garb, and how Zehu became the god and king of the Romans, and the love of the Romans for the Jews, which he has in the Judah passages, but it wasn't really Jews. Actually, they were Jews, but nobody considers them Jews. Herod's father, Antipater, right, who was not considered Jewish, but they considered him Jewish. And of course, Nicholas of Damascus made them all Jews in his 144 book, Peon, for the Jews. But Herod, to all intents and purposes, was Jewish. He functioned as a Jewish king, just like all the other kings of his period. Happily killed his family, or unhappily killed his family, since it drove him half insane. But this is one of the problems of kingship. I'll close, I guess, with Agnon's famous quip in Leach Telelun. He says on the Shabbat afternoon, You should read a little in the book of Mishlei Shualim to learn about the behavior of animals, and also in Sefer Yosippon to learn about the behavior of men. And his psychological insights developed from Josephus are a great training for anybody who wants to learn about human nature.
Yeah, and I'll close by mentioning, first of all, I think, Chanukah time, I just heard, so there's a podcast, actually, interesting, I'm doing this now, Rabbi Dr. David Katz's Jewish History podcast. I think he just did he just did an episode on Yosippon as well. I think it's titled Yosippon there, but he did it as well. And he discussed, I think he mentioned that the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Hashem Gansfried mentions, for those interested in the Chanukah story, to read it, Yosippon, and look there. And, again, he talks more about it in some different ways, if those are interested in checking that podcast out. And yeah, it's a very interesting work. We mentioned Flussers is still available from Mossad Bialik in Israel. Hamaners might be available used. I'm not sure if it's actually in print. The other one, the 2-volume one, whatever, that's available in the stores. And now we have these English translation of yours. Yeah. So I will link to
also you might mention that Berdyshevsky and his Berdyshevsky used Yosippon tremendously to create Jewish heroes. And his Derech V'Choka is a magnificent piece as a student story, or a child story, actually. But it was an argument against the rabbis that he was fighting in the rise of Jewish nationalism.
Yeah, it's definitely been, I hope we kind of emphasize as much, again, how popular it really was and how used it was. And, I think to some extent remains. I don't want to say that it's not. Listeners will say, well, it is still. So, yeah. I will link to this in the show's notes. If anyone is interested, they can purchase it. It's a pretty large book. I want to say let me see how many pages it is. It's over 500 pages. I think paperback, available around $49, I want to say, is the list price. But those, I'll put a link in the shows. Those listeners can check it out. And thank you, Professor Bowman, for joining me.
Well, it was fun.